Writing this for Lit Reactor, which grew out of your fan site. Lit Reactor has really become a place where people are finding their first writing communities. And could you tell me a little bit about your first writing community that you were a part of?
My first writing group was led by a writer named Andrea Carlisle, and she had written one collection of short stories called the River House Stories, and she taught through this workshop. It consisted of me and mostly, entirely, very pleasant middle-aged white ladies, and they were all writing some form of memoir or a thriller in that very Jodi Picoult way where a child is always in peril. Mm-hmm. And I was writing very different things. And eventually Andrea came to me after a year or two and said that the other students had approached her and said they were no longer comfortable having me in the classroom anymore, that my work was too upsetting and they didn't feel safe around me. But there was this writer who had just moved to Portland named Tom Spanbauer. And so Andrea suggested that Tom would be a better fit. And I got dumped on Tom, and it made all the difference.
Your current group is pretty famous within the Lit Reactor community. Lydia's taught a lot of classes with us. Tell me a little bit, I know that kind of started with Tom Spanbauer. Tell me a little bit about how you got together with your current group.
After the core of us had been in Tom's group since 1990, and we had really learned so much of what Tom taught. And for a large part we were kind of running Tom's workshop, that Tom would defer to Monica Drake or me or Aaron or Susie Vitello, people who had been in his workshop long enough to be able to repeat the lessons. And so as new work was presented, Tom would toss the ball to Monica to comment on it first, so that he himself wasn't always teaching those same lessons of minimalism. And each of us was kind of learning a greater understanding in being able to teach the lessons that he had taught us. So first we learned how to do it, and then we learned how to teach it, which gave us a greater depth in understanding the distinction of what we were doing. But beyond that, we really needed to free up the seats in the workshop and make them available to new writers. So we broke off and became a workshop of our own that was really more about, reiterating those lessons of minimalism so that we would stay with them, so our writing would not sort of degrade. But also in holding each other accountable to produce work every week so that we wouldn't get lazy and sloppy and quit writing, which happens so easily when you don't have a group expecting you every week to bring pages.
I know there's a lot of women in your current group. Your work is considered masculine by a lot of people, and I'm kind of curious to see the influence that the ladies who read and workshop your work have had on your work.
Yeah, I really hate to generalize because there are women in the current workshop, Chelsea Kane, who never takes it too far. Chelsea's always up for another gruesome detail, and she's always delighted when someone can contribute a more gruesome detail to something that she has written. And women like Lydia Yuknevich, who are really up for messing with the structure and presenting really raw, very challenging subject matter. So there are, it's not strictly a gender thing, that there are women in the workshop who are braver than most male writers. Mm-hmm. And then there are also women who are really timid in the workshop. And so I would say that timidity is not necessarily tied to their gender either.
Is there a dream critique partner that you have that you've not worked with that you'd love to join your workshop?
Mm-hmm. Occasionally I've asked visiting writers, friends of mine, to stop in. And Doug Copeland, who wrote Generation X, he's always very smart about nailing what's missing in a piece of work. So it's always great to have him sit in on the workshop. Boy, George Saunders And if the mountain won't come to Mohammed, I would love to spend a summer in Syracuse, just kind of as a fly on the wall in one of Saunders' workshops. I'd love to see how he does it.
How did you decide to go the graphic novel route for Fight Club 2? Was it something that you considered early on? And I'd also like to know a little bit about the process, like how it's differed writing a graphic novel versus literature.
How it started was one evening, Chelsea came through a dinner party, and she invited comic luminaries. She invited Brian Michael Bendis, and she invited Matt Fraction, and they came and with the intention of really talking to me, coaching me about doing a comic, not specifically Fight Club, but doing a graphic novel. And they talked to me about the process and how it differed from publishing literary fiction, and they talked to me about how easy it was, and they offered to hold my hand through learning this new process. And I had also delivered almost all of the story collection that I had coming out this spring, Make Something Up. So for the first time in years, I had a block of time where I could afford to be a student again and really learn a new form. I could devote a huge amount of time to it, 2 years to it. So with the kind of hand-holding from Matt Fraction and Kelly Sue McCormick and Brian Michael Bendis, and with the time I had, it just was the perfect combination of elements that I needed to do this.
And were you a fan of graphic novels or comics?
I wasn't a fan really since adolescence. And very early on, back in 1990, 2000, Marvel and DC had approached me about doing a limited series of 14 books. But at the time, I knew it would be like screenwriting for me. It would be such an entirely different form of storytelling that I would either mess it up and do a miserable job, or I would take 2 or 3 years learning how to do it before I could do a decent job. And so it was a time in my career that I couldn't set aside that much, resources just to learn how to do a 14-book series.
When you originally wrote Fight Club, was there an end cap there, or were you already sort of projecting into the future and thinking where you could take it beyond the final page?
No, really, the end was the end. That I wanted it this very limited, this very small window through which to see this story, and that it would be just one aberrant event in one character's life, and that would be the end. But I didn't realize I was going to have to talk about that 185-page story for the rest of my life.
Would you and Jack be friends in real life? Or have you been?
Boy, that sounds like such a euphemism. Are you friends with Jack? Whoa. I don't think so, because I don't think Jack could be anybody's friend. I think Jack is so unstable and so unsure of himself that Jack would never reveal enough of himself to be anything but an acquaintance, anyone's acquaintance.
Looking back at your full body of work, what would you have picked to be your breakout work, if you had to say?
I think it happened very naturally and kind of perfectly, that I had written things before Fight Club that will always be grateful were not my breakout thing. And so I think it was completely appropriate that Fight Club was my breakout thing. It wasn't intended as that, but I'm glad it was that. And that's something I tell beginning authors or authors who have 1 or 2 manuscripts under their belt, is that they get one first book, and they really want that book to be something that generates a lot of energy. That's why directors, I think, young directors are attracted to my work, because they know that they want their first horse out of the gate to be something that really develops a buzz and a reputation that lingers for long enough that they can get another project put together. And so you want the thing to stay in the popular imagination long enough for you to launch another thing. And so I really try to dissuade writers from coming to market with something that's not that breakout fantastic thing.
Have you ever thought about doing straight up genre fiction?
You know, I think I always intend to. I start out thinking, okay, Beautiful You is going to be, you know, one of these books where it's an innocent girl with an ethnic best friend, and she gets picked up by this man of power and manipulated, and she must attain her own form of power and fight back against him, and blah, blah, blah. But I don't think that would hold my interest to try to do it straight the entire way through. And there's always this element of camp that comes into all my work. Fight Club has got a lot of camp, a lot of kind of Dionysian comedy where horrible things happen and people react to them in a less than dramatic way. They don't react to the full drama of what's happening. And that occurs as humor. When Jack gets his face pounded into the floor and Tyler looks down at this bloody mask and he says, "Cool," instead of reacting in horror. And it's this disconnect, this kind of campy acceptance of what's happening that always makes my work go off the tracks.
Is your drive to push these boundaries of good taste intentional, or is it just kind of where your work leads you?
It really is where the work leads, because you can't intentionally shock yourself. It's a very gradual process to try to take a premise and develop it and keep developing it to the point where it surprises and really shocks you, the author. And so I don't think you can intentionally arrive at that place, that it has to be a place that you can get to, but you have to fool yourself into going there. And at the same time, you have to kind of charm and fool the audience, because if the audience knows that you're going to end up in that swimming pool drowning, then the audience is not going to go there. It's really a gradual process of making them laugh and relaxing them and then shocking them in greater and greater ways. So, in a way, you're doing that to yourself first.
Have you written anything that's too shocking to publish?
Oh, you know, not too shocking, but I have written things that were a little raw and not, I don't have a way into them yet. I wrote a story, there's a form of exhibitionism where people don't flush the toilet after having a bowel movement. They leave it there so that someone else will find it. And it's kind of a weird way of flashing them. Is somebody's going to see my poop. And it gives people such jollies. And so I wanted to combine this with kind of internet stalking. And I staged a meeting in which Reese Witherspoon is meeting with her production team, her marketing people, and they're gradually breaking it to her that there is this Eastern European website called Reese's Feces, which purports to be showing pictures of her unflushed business. And I thought it worked, and it had a great redemptive ending, and Reese Witherspoon ended up looking fantastically brilliant and kind of evil, but just plain out smart at the end, and very sympathetic. But that was one of the things that the workshop shot down. I don't think the world is ready for a poop story like that.
What else would you like to learn? Is there something else that you haven't done that you'd really like to delve into?
Screenwriting. Right now, I have the first draft of the screenplay for Lullaby, and Andy Mingo has written it, and it's so long and it is so faithful to the book that it bores the piss out of me. And I really want to see Andy swing away from the book in big ways. So right now we're meeting, trying to come up with some completely new kind of interstitial scenes that can be repeated throughout the narrative, where we can keep the story arc intact, but we can have some really bold, surprising, escalating things in between the scenes. And that new element will make it really fresh for me. And I think for people who read the book, they'll be grateful for those scenes too.
So you've written some fantastic craft essays for the Reactor, and I know you taught your first class for us last year. Is there a career in academia in your future?
I would like there to be. And last year I did the experiment with a kind of writer's scavenger hunt, where I talked about different techniques or devices in narrative, and rewarded people who found the best examples of them in popular narrative.
Right.
And then were able to replicate those devices in their own work. So I would like to create a series of exercises like that make people really present to how the things that they consume, the stories they consume, how those things are put together, and then ultimately they themselves can replicate those different techniques in their own work. So I don't want it to be a really dry textbook
Right.
or a really dry course. I want it to feel like a series of games that really engage people.
Tell me a little bit about your writing space.
You know, my writing space, most of my writing gets done in the world. I always have a hard copy of whatever story I'm working on, and I scribble all over it, and I carry it with me all the time. And it's pretty rare that I actually sit down at the computer, but when I do, I will make all the revisions that have occurred to me over days and in wildly different places, hotel rooms, airports, walking the dog, restaurants. But I will put all those revisions into the file and print a brand new hard copy, and then I will carry that around for another week, making ongoing small revisions to it. And also taking it to workshop, where people will suggest things or ask about aspects of the story that I've neglected. And then I will put those changes in. So it really is just a constant accumulation and revision in the world before I actually sit down and do that kind of keyboarding.
Start to finish, what's the longest time frame that you've spent working on a novel, say?
On a novel?
Or I suppose if there are any short stories that ended up taking longer.
Short stories take so long. That's what kills me, is that writing Phoenix, that went into the story collection, the Phoenix story took about 8 months to a year. And if you include when I write a story and then I take it on the road and I revise it according to audience reaction, then it can take over a year.
Okay.
And so many of the stories in Make Something Up are stories that took a year or two to really come to what they are. Because sometimes I don't know where the laugh is. And there'll be moments like in the story Romance where the narrator says, so we go to Lollapalooza and we pitch my tent, and there would always be a huge laugh at pitch my tent. And I didn't know that was a euphemism. But the audience of young people knew, and they thought it was the funniest moment in that sequence.
Is there one question that you always wish someone would ask you?
It always changes. But right now it is my little tirade against dialogue. And writing for comics has made me even more dialogue adverse. I've noticed that I come from a big family. And when you come from many siblings, if you're going to say something, you have to make a hole first before you say it. So you always say, like, listen to this, listen up. And then you say your thing. Mm-hmm. You always have to clear a big space, get there listening, and then you say it. But I've noticed among my friends who had one or no siblings that they just say what they say. And they trust that the world is going to pick it up on the first pass. And so much of my writing opens with these introductory clauses in every line of dialogue, which function as somebody from a big family. I'm about to say something important, but this is not it. And then the important thing. Mm-hmm. And in comics, I've gotten that I don't have to be wordy like that. I can just state everything in one or two words. And that those words are placed in sequence, adjacent to each other in different panels, but they still will read in series. Mm-hmm. And so little can be done with so few words or with no words whatsoever. So comics have made me even less likely to use dialogue. And I really dislike so much of television with very low production values, where it is just a two-shot of actors saying things to each other. You know, saying this is going to happen, this is going to happen. And everything is furthered with dialogue. Mm-hmm. That's something that Tom Spanbauer taught, is that never further plot with dialogue. It's the least effective way to further plot. So you've got to present things in such a way that the reader realizes what is about to happen or what has happened. And then, if you have to, you can confirm that with dialogue, but only after the reader has figured it out. And so, less dialogue.
Thanks.
Thank you.